Good evening all, and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight I venture into the frozen darkness of Alaska's most isolated communities where help is hundreds of miles away and winter nights last for months. In this episode, we will descend into 8 deeply disturbing accounts from small towns scattered across America's final frontier. These are not campfire tales or internet fabrications. Each story has been meticulously reconstructed from first-hand testimonies, police reports, and witness statements provided by those who lived through experiences that defy rational explanation. From law enforcement officers who confronted impossible truths to residents who witnessed events that forever shattered their understanding of reality. These narratives come from the very edge of human comprehension. To protect the privacy and safety of those involved, certain names and identifying details have been altered. But the essence of what occurred remains uncompromisingly authentic. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Paranoia Files for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what lurks in the shadows of our most remote places. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now let us begin our journey into Alaska's frozen heart, where isolation breeds horrors that the outside world will never truly understand. My name is Liam, and I have been the only sheriff's deputy in Coldfoot, Alaska for 12 years. When people ask me what it is like being the law in a town of fewer than 20 permanent residents, I usually tell them it is quiet, uneventful. The kind of job where your biggest concern is making sure the handful of locals are not drinking too much at the Frozen Toe Saloon on Friday nights. But that is not entirely true. There was one night that changed everything I thought I knew about my job, about my town, and about the kind of evil that can drift through a place so remote that most people forget it even exists. It was late February. The kind of winter night where the temperature drops to 40 below and the darkness feels absolute. The sun had not risen above the horizon in weeks and would not for weeks more. I was sitting in my truck at the edge of town, parked near the Dalton Highway, nursing a thermos of coffee and listening to static on the radio. Traffic through Coldfoot is rare in winter, maybe a few ice road truckers each week, the occasional supply vehicle heading north to Prudhoe Bay. Most nights I would sit there for hours and see nothing but empty roads stretching into the black void. That night around 11:30 I saw headlights approaching from the south. The vehicle was moving slowly, too slowly for the conditions, weaving slightly between the lanes. I watched it come closer, my hand instinctively moving to the radio to call it in, though there was no one to call. The nearest state trooper was 3 hours away in Fairbanks, and in this weather, help was not coming quickly no matter what happened. The car passed me and I pulled out behind it, flipping on my lights. The vehicle took nearly a quarter mile to stop, pulling over onto the narrow shoulder where snow was piled high on both sides. I approached carefully, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The car was old, a sedan that looked like it had seen better days. The rear bumper held on with duct tape, rust eating through the wheel wells. Alaska plates, but not from around here. I tapped on the window and it rolled down slowly. The man behind the wheel looked wrong. That is the only way I can describe it. He was maybe 40 with a gaunt face and eyes that would not quite meet mine. He was wearing a heavy parka, but underneath I could see a dress shirt and tie completely inappropriate for the conditions. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel, though whether from cold or nerves I could not tell. I asked for his license and registration. He fumbled in the glove compartment for a long time, longer than it should have taken, and when he handed me the documents, his hands were trembling badly. The license said his name was Robert Hendricks, address in Anchorage. The registration matched. Nothing obviously wrong, but every instinct I had developed over 12 years was screaming that something was not right. I asked him where he was headed. He said Deadhorse, all the way to the end of the Dalton Highway. I asked him why. He paused too long before answering, then said he had a job waiting. work on the oil fields. His voice was flat, rehearsed, like he had practiced the lie but had not quite gotten it right. I asked him what kind of work. He said maintenance. I asked which company. He could not remember the name. I told him to step out of the vehicle. He hesitated, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter, and for a moment I thought he might try to drive off. But then he opened the door and climbed out, moving stiffly like his muscles were not quite cooperating. He was taller than I expected, thin in a way that suggested he had not been eating well. I asked him if he had been drinking. He said no. I asked him to walk a straight line. He did perfectly, no signs of intoxication. But I could not shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. I told him I was going to search his vehicle, that I had reasonable suspicion he might be transporting something illegal. He did not protest, did not ask what I was suspicious of, just stood there in the cold with his arms wrapped around himself, staring at the ground. That should have been my first real warning. Innocent people protest. Innocent people get angry when you want to search their car. This man just stood there waiting. I started with the front seat, shining my flashlight into the footwells, checking under the seats. Fast food wrappers, empty coffee cups, a road atlas, nothing unusual. I moved to the back seat and found more of the same, signs of someone who had been living in their car for days or maybe weeks. I popped the trunk, and that is when everything changed. The trunk was full of trash bags, black heavy-duty ones tied off at the top. There had to be 8 or 10 of them, stuffed in so tightly there was barely room for anything else. I asked him what was in the bags. He said clothes, personal belongings, everything he owned. I asked why they were in trash bags. He said he had been evicted, had to pack quickly. I pulled one of the bags out. It was heavier than it should have been for clothes. I untied it and looked inside, shining my flashlight into the opening. At first, I could not process what I was seeing. There were clothes, yes, but underneath them were other things. Photographs, dozens of them, all of women. Some were casual shots taken from a distance, the subjects unaware they were being photographed. Others were closer, more intimate, taken through windows. And beneath the photographs were personal items, jewelry, hairbrushes, articles of clothing that clearly belonged to women. I felt my heart rate spike. I kept my voice calm and asked him what this was. He did not answer. I reached into another bag, then another. They were all the same. Photographs, personal items, and in one bag near the bottom, driver licenses. 7 of them, all belonging to different women, all from different parts of Alaska. I told him to put his hands on the car. He did slowly, still not speaking. I radioed for backup, knowing it would be hours before anyone could reach me, and started going through the bags more systematically. The more I found, the sicker I felt. Maps with locations marked, notebook pages with addresses and schedules, descriptions of routines. This was not a collection of random items. This was a hunting log. I arrested him, put him in handcuffs, and placed him in the back of my truck. Then I returned to his car and continued searching. In the front seat, tucked under the passenger side floor mat, I found a knife. It was large, the kind hunters use for field dressing game, with a fixed blade and a handle that showed signs of heavy use. There were stains on it that looked like blood, though it was impossible to tell for certain in the darkness and cold. By this point, it was past midnight and the temperature had dropped even further. I sat in my truck with the engine running, the heater struggling to keep up, and waited for backup that I knew would not arrive until dawn at the earliest. The man in my back seat said nothing. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his breath fogging the window. I tried to engage him, to get him to talk, to explain what I had found. He remained silent. I started making calls. First to the state troopers in Fairbanks, explaining what I had found and requesting immediate assistance. Then to police departments in Anchorage, Fairbanks, and every other major town in Alaska, asking if they had any open missing persons cases that might match the descriptions of the women in the photographs. The answers started coming back within the hour. 3 of the women in the photographs had been reported missing in the past 18 months. 2 from Anchorage, 1 from Fairbanks. The other 4 had not been reported, or if they had, the information had not made it into the system yet. I looked at the man in my back seat and asked him where the women were. He did not answer. I asked him if they were still alive. He closed his eyes. I asked him how many there were. Still nothing. I felt a rage building in me that I had never experienced before, a desire to drag him out of the truck and make him talk. Consequences be damned. But I held myself together, focused on procedure, on making sure that when this went to court, there would be no mistakes that could let him walk free. Dawn came slowly, the darkness giving way to a deep twilight that passed for daylight in February. At 7 in the morning, a state trooper vehicle finally arrived, followed an hour later by a forensics team that had driven up from Fairbanks. They took over the scene, photographing everything, cataloging every item in the car, taking the man into custody for transport back to Fairbanks for processing. I spent the next 3 days working with detectives, going through everything we had found, matching photographs to missing persons reports, trying to piece together a timeline. What emerged was terrifying. The man, Robert Hendricks, had been moving through Alaska for at least 2 years, targeting women who lived alone, who had minimal social connections, who would not be missed immediately. He would watch them for weeks, learn their routines, wait for the right moment. The personal items in his trunk were trophies taken after the attacks. The investigators found his hunting cabin 3 weeks later, hidden in the woods off a remote logging road near Talkeetna. Inside, they found remains, burial sites, evidence of at least 11 victims spanning multiple years. Some of the women matched the photographs in his trunk. Others did not, suggesting there were victims we still had not identified. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I testified about the traffic stop, about what I had found in his vehicle. The evidence was overwhelming, and his defense attorney could do little but argue for life in prison instead of the death penalty. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. But here is what haunts me. What keeps me awake some nights when the darkness feels too heavy and the isolation too complete. If I had not been sitting on that particular stretch of road at that particular time, if I had been 5 minutes later getting to my usual spot, he would have driven right through Coldfoot and continued north. There are hundreds of miles of empty road between Coldfoot and Deadhorse, countless places where a car could disappear, where evidence could be hidden in the vast wilderness and never found. And if he had made it to Deadhorse, to the oil fields where workers come and go constantly and no one pays much attention to strangers, he could have started over, found new hunting grounds, continued for years more. I think about the randomness of it sometimes, how chance and timing intersected in a way that saved lives. But I also think about how many others might be out there, drifting through Alaska's remote highways, moving through communities too small to have adequate law enforcement, targeting people in places where disappearances can be attributed to the harsh environment rather than human evil. The vastness that makes Alaska beautiful also makes it a perfect hunting ground for people who understand how to exploit isolation. I still work in Coldfoot. I still sit in my truck on winter nights watching the empty highway, drinking coffee and waiting. But now I know that the darkness is not always empty, that evil can drift through even the most remote places, and that the line between another quiet night and something monstrous can be as thin as a chance traffic stop on a frozen road in the middle of nowhere. Every car I pull over now, every stranger who passes through, I look at differently. I search more carefully. I trust my instincts more readily because I know what I almost missed, and I know what it would have cost if I had let him drive past into the night. The people in Anchorage and Fairbanks, they sleep easier now knowing he is in prison. But those of us who work in the remote places, who understand how truly isolated you can be in Alaska, we know the truth. He was one man in one car on one night. How many others are out there driving through the darkness, hunting in places where no one is watching? That is the question that keeps me awake, and it is the question I cannot answer. All I can do is keep watching, keep stopping the cars that seem wrong, keep trusting that feeling in my gut that something is not right. Because in a place like Coldfoot, where I am the only law for 100 miles in any direction, that instinct is all that stands between the innocent and the evil that drifts through the darkness looking for its next victim. I never should have taken that night security job at the abandoned Kantishna copper mine. But when you are broke in a town as small as Healy, Alaska, and someone offers you $15 an hour to sit in a trailer for 8 hours and make sure no one steals equipment, you do not ask too many questions. You take the money and you tell yourself it is just temporary, just until something better comes along. That was my mistake. That was when everything started. The Kantishna mine had been closed for almost 30 years. It operated from the 1950s through the early 1990s, pulling copper and small amounts of gold out of the mountain before the company went bankrupt and abandoned the whole operation. The main shaft went down almost 800 feet with dozens of side tunnels branching off into the rock. When they closed it, they were supposed to seal everything properly, but this was Alaska in the 90s and regulations were not enforced the way they should have been. They put up some chain link fence, posted some warning signs, and called it done. A mining exploration company out of Anchorage had bought the mineral rights 2 years ago and was doing surveys to see if it was worth reopening. That meant bringing in equipment, doing test drilling, taking core samples. And that meant they needed someone to watch the site overnight to make sure the locals did not strip the copper wiring or steal the generators. That someone was me. My name is Noah, and I had been working at the Healy coal mine until they laid off half the crew 6 months earlier. I was behind on rent, behind on everything, and when my buddy told me about this security gig, I jumped on it without thinking. The pay was decent and the work seemed easy. Show up at 8 in the evening, walk the perimeter once an hour, sit in the heated trailer the rest of the time, leave at 4 in the morning. Simple. The first week was exactly that. Boring, cold, uneventful. I would drive out to the site as the sun was setting, park my truck next to the trailer, and spend the night reading paperbacks and listening to talk radio. The mine property was about 15 acres, mostly just open ground with piles of old tailings, a few rusted-out buildings, and the main shaft entrance, which was blocked off with a steel gate and a heavy padlock. Once an hour, I would bundle up, grab my flashlight, and walk the fence line, checking for any signs of disturbance. There never were any. Most nights I did not see another human being from the time I arrived until I left. It was during my second week that I started hearing the sounds. At first I thought it was the wind. The mine sat at the base of a ridge and the wind would come screaming down off the mountain, howling through the old buildings and making the metal roofing bang and clatter. But these sounds were different. They came from underground, rising up through the ventilation shafts that were scattered around the property. Voices, or something like voices. Low and indistinct, multiple tones overlapping, never quite forming words I could understand. The first time I heard them clearly, I was doing my midnight perimeter check. I had walked past one of the old ventilation shafts, just a concrete collar sticking up out of the ground with a rusted grate over it. And I heard what sounded like people talking deep underground. I stopped and listened, my breath fogging in the cold air, straining to make out words. The voices would rise and fall, sometimes seeming close, sometimes fading away to almost nothing. I convinced myself it was water running through the tunnels or air pressure equalizing, some natural explanation that made sense. But the next night I heard them again, and this time they were louder. I was in the trailer eating a sandwich and half listening to a hockey game on the radio when the voices started. They were coming up through the floor, vibrating through the thin walls of the trailer. I turned off the radio and sat very still, listening. There had to be a dozen different voices, all talking at once, the sound rising and falling in waves. I could almost make out words, almost understand what they were saying, but every time I focused on one voice, it would slip away and blend back into the general murmur. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, following the sound. It was loudest near the main shaft entrance. I approached the steel gate, shining my light through the bars into the darkness beyond. The tunnel descended at a steep angle, disappearing into black about 20 feet in. The voices were definitely coming from down there, echoing up the shaft, carried on cold air that smelled like wet rock and rust. I called out, asking if anyone was down there. The voices stopped immediately. The silence was so sudden and complete that it felt wrong, like the mine itself was holding its breath. I waited, listening, my heart pounding. After maybe 2 minutes, the voices started again, but now they sounded different, agitated, urgent. Like they were responding to me calling out, but in a language I could not understand. I backed away from the gate and returned to the trailer. I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself that there was a rational explanation. Maybe kids had found another way into the mine and were messing around down there. Maybe there were homeless people using the tunnels as shelter. Maybe it was some acoustic phenomenon I did not understand. Sound carrying from miles away and being amplified by the rock. But none of those explanations felt right. The next day I called my supervisor and asked him about the mine's history. He told me what I already knew about the operations in the closure. But when I pressed him about accidents or deaths, he got quiet. Then he told me about the cave-in. In 1973, a section of the mine had collapsed, trapping 17 men in a side tunnel. The rescue operation lasted 4 days. They could hear the men through the rock, hear them calling for help, but the tunnel was too unstable to dig through safely. On the 4th day, the voices stopped. When they finally reached the chamber 6 days later, all 17 were dead. He told me this in a matter-of-fact way, like it was just history, just something that happened. Then he asked me why I wanted to know. I told him I had been hearing sounds at night, voices coming from the mine. He was quiet for a long moment, then said something that made my blood run cold. He said I was not the first security guard to report hearing voices. The guy before me had quit after 2 weeks, refused to go back to the site, would not even explain why. The guy before that lasted 5 nights. I asked why he had not told me this before I took the job. He said he did not think I would believe it, that most people did not, and he needed someone to watch the site. Then he offered me a raise. $5 more per hour if I stayed. I needed the money badly enough that I said yes. That night I brought a digital recorder with me. I wanted proof, wanted something I could play back in daylight to convince myself I was not losing my mind. I set it up near the main shaft entrance and let it run while I did my perimeter checks and tried to stay calm in the trailer. The voices started just after 11. They were louder than ever, more distinct, and for the first time I could make out actual words. They were not speaking English. It sounded older, harsher, like something I had heard once in a documentary about indigenous languages. I went to the shaft entrance and the voices rose to meet me, dozens of them now, all calling out, all trying to be heard at once. I stood there in the darkness with my flashlight beam cutting through the bars of the gate, and I realized they were not just making noise. They were pleading. The tone was unmistakable, desperate and afraid, the sound of people begging for help. And beneath it all was another sound, a deep rhythmic pounding like sledgehammers hitting rock. I ran back to the trailer, locked the door, and sat there shaking until my shift ended. When I retrieved the recorder the next morning, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely work the buttons. I played it back in my truck, listening to the whole 8-hour recording. The voices were there, clear and undeniable. Hours of overlapping speech calling out in a language I could not identify, rising and falling in waves of desperation. And that pounding sound, steady and relentless, like something trying to break through from the other side. I took the recording to a professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks who specialized in indigenous languages. I told her I had found it on an old cassette tape and wanted to know what language was being spoken. She listened to the whole thing, her expression growing more troubled with each minute. When it finished, she asked me where I had really gotten it. I insisted it was from an old tape. She did not believe me, but she told me what I had asked for. The language was a dialect of Denaina, an Athabaskan language spoken by native peoples in the region. But it was old, archaic, using grammar structures that had not been common for more than a century. She had only been able to make out a few phrases clearly. They were calling for help. They were saying they were trapped, that the mountain had swallowed them, that the darkness was full of something they could not see but could feel all around them. They were begging someone, anyone, to get them out before it took them all. I went back to the mine that night because I needed the money and because part of me had to know. I brought a better flashlight, a camera, and a sense of dread that sat in my stomach like ice. The voices started earlier than usual before I had even finished my first perimeter check. They were frantic now, screaming, the sound of pure terror echoing up from hundreds of feet underground. I went to the gate and saw something that made my legs go weak. The padlock was still secured, the gate still locked, but beyond it, in the darkness of the tunnel, there were lights. Flickering orange lights like oil lanterns or torches moving in the depths, and shadows, dozens of them cast huge against the tunnel walls. The shadows of men digging, swinging picks and sledges, moving in jerking, desperate motions. I took photographs, my camera flash strobing into the tunnel, freezing the shadows in harsh white light. In that brief illumination, I saw them clearly. Figures in work clothes from another era, covered in dirt and blood, their faces twisted in agony and fear. They were not looking at me, they were looking behind them, deeper into the mine, at something I could not see. Something that was making them dig with the strength of the damned, trying to break through rock that would never yield. Then the lights went out. All at once, like someone had thrown a switch. The voices cut off mid-scream. The silence that followed was worse than any sound I had ever heard. I stood there in the dark, my flashlight beam shaking so badly I could barely hold it, and I felt something looking back at me from the depths of that mine. Something old and patient and hungry. Something that had been down there long before the miners came and would be there long after we were all gone. I got in my truck and drove away. I called my supervisor from a gas station in Healy and told him I quit. He asked me to reconsider, offered me more money, said they really needed someone. I told him to seal the mine properly, to fill in the shaft with concrete and never let anyone go down there again. Then I hung up. The photographs I took were useless, just darkness and stone, grainy shadows that could have been anything or nothing. The digital recorder captured only silence. After that moment, the lights went out. No evidence, no proof. Nothing I could show anyone to make them believe. But I know what I heard down there, and I know what I saw. Those men trapped in the cave and back in '73, they did not just die from lack of air or thirst. Something else was down there with them in the darkness, something that had always been in that mountain, and when they broke through into its domain, it claimed them. Their voices are still there, trapped in the rock, reliving those final days over and over, digging desperately toward a rescue that never came while something circles them in the dark. The exploration company gave up on the Kantishna mine 3 months later. They said the mineral content did not justify the cost of reopening. But I heard through the grapevine that the surveyors refused to go back after their equipment started malfunctioning near the main shaft. They heard voices too. Everyone who spends time at that mine hears them eventually. The voices are still there, calling up through the ventilation shafts, echoing through the old tunnels, begging for help that will never come. And something else is still down there too, waiting in the darkness, patient and eternal, ready to claim anyone foolish enough to descend into its domain. I think about those miners sometimes, about how their last days were spent in such fear and desperation that their voices burned into the stone itself. But mostly I try not to think about it at all. Some jobs are not worth any amount of money, and some places should stay abandoned, sealed away, forgotten. The Kantishna mine is one of them. Ethan here. As a search and rescue coordinator in Galena, Alaska, I have seen people disappear into the wilderness more times than I care to count. Most of the time, we find them within 48 hours, cold and scared but alive. Sometimes we find remains, evidence of exposure or animal attacks or simple bad luck. And sometimes we find nothing at all, just empty forest that swallows people whole and never gives them back. But I have never seen anything like what happened with the Riverside hunting party. That case broke every rule I thought I understood about how people vanish in the wild. It started on October 15th when we got a call from a woman in Anchorage saying her husband and his 3 friends had not checked in from their hunting trip. They were supposed to call via satellite phone every evening at 6 o'clock. They had missed 2 calls in a row. That alone was not unusual. Satellite phones malfunction, batteries die, people get caught up in the hunt and forget to check the time. But this woman insisted something was wrong. She said her husband was meticulous about communication, that he would never miss 2 check-ins without a very good reason. We assembled a search team the next morning, 4 of us, all experienced in wilderness rescue, equipped for a week-long operation if necessary. The hunting party had filed a trip plan with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, so we knew exactly where they were supposed to be. A section of state forest about 60 miles northwest of Galena, remote but not impossibly so, accessible by bush plane and relatively well mapped. They had flown in on October 10th, planning to spend a week hunting moose and caribou before flying back out on the 17th. We chartered a plane and flew to their campsite. The weather was clear, cold but not dangerously so, with good visibility. As we approached the coordinates they had listed, I started scanning the ground for their camp. What I saw made no sense. The campsite was there. I could see the bright orange of their tents against the autumn colors of the tundra. But something was wrong with the way it looked, too still, too undisturbed. We landed on a gravel bar near the camp and hiked the 1/4 mile to the site. The first thing I noticed was the complete absence of people. No one came out to greet us, no sounds of activity, nothing. The camp consisted of 4 tents arranged in a semicircle around a central fire pit, with equipment and supplies organized neatly nearby. Everything was in perfect order, too perfect. The tents were zipped shut from the outside. I opened the first one and found sleeping bags, personal gear, rifles, ammunition, everything you would expect. Nothing was disturbed or missing. The second tent was the same, and the third. The 4th tent, the largest one set up as a communal space, contained their food supplies, cooking equipment, and the satellite phone. The phone was sitting on a folding table, fully charged, showing no missed calls or messages. It was working perfectly. Outside, the fire pit contained the remains of a fire that looked several days old. I examined the ashes and charred wood. Based on the decomposition and weathering, the last time this fire had burned was probably October 12th or 13th, right around the time they should have been settling into their hunt. The firewood was stacked nearby, untouched. Enough for another week at least. We began searching the perimeter of the camp, looking for tracks, signs of where they might have gone. That is when things started to make even less sense. There were boot prints around the camp, clear impressions in the soft ground near the tents and fire pit, but they did not lead anywhere. I followed one set of tracks from a tent toward the tree line. They were clear and distinct, the deep tread of hiking boots pressed into the dirt. Then, about 30 feet from the tent, they just stopped. Not faded, not obscured by wind or rain. They simply ended mid-stride, as if the person making them had been lifted straight up into the air. I called the others over and we examined the tracks carefully. We found 3 more sets, all the same. Clear boot prints leading away from the camp in different directions, each one stopping abruptly with no explanation. No signs of a struggle, no drag marks, no disturbed vegetation. Just tracks that ended in the middle of open ground as if the men had ceased to exist. We expanded our search, moving in concentric circles around the camp, looking for any sign of the hunters. We found nothing. No tracks beyond those impossible truncated trails. No evidence of where they had gone or what had happened to them. Their rifles were all accounted for, still in the tents. Their packs were still hanging from the trees where they had been stored to keep them away from bears. Even their personal items, wallets, phones, everything was still in camp. On the second day, we found something that made everything worse. About 100 yards from camp, in a small clearing surrounded by spruce trees, there was a 5th set of boot prints. These were different. They walked in a perfect circle, maybe 20 feet in diameter, pressed deep into the moss and grass. Around and around, hundreds of circuits, the tracks overlapping and reinforcing each other until they had worn a groove in the ground. In the center of the circle was a backpack. One of the hunter's packs. We confirmed it by the identification tag, but it had not been stored with the others back at camp. We opened the pack carefully. Inside was a journal, a small leather-bound notebook that belonged to one of the men. I read through it with growing unease. The entries started normally, describing the flight in, setting up camp, plans for the hunt. But the entries from October 12th were different. He wrote about hearing something in the forest, a sound like singing but not quite, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He wrote about the others hearing it too, about how they could not agree on what direction it was coming from. The entry from October 13th was barely coherent, just fragments of sentences about the sky being wrong, about the trees moving when they should have been still, about time feeling elastic and strange. The final entry, dated October 14th, was a single sentence. We should not have answered when it called our names. We called in additional resources, state troopers, more search and rescue teams, a helicopter with thermal imaging equipment. Over the next week, we covered hundreds of square miles, searching every drainage, every stand of timber, every possible place 4 men could have gone or hidden or fallen. We found nothing. No remains, no equipment, no trace of their passage beyond that camp and those impossible tracks. The investigation went on for months. The FBI got involved because of the possibility of foul play. They examined the campsite, the journal, every piece of evidence we had collected. They interviewed family members, checked financial records, looked for any indication that the men might have staged their own disappearances. They found nothing suspicious. These were ordinary men, friends since college, who went hunting together every year. No debts, no enemies, no reason to vanish. The official conclusion was that they had died of exposure somewhere in the wilderness, and their remains had been scavenged by animals. But that explanation does not account for the evidence. It does not explain the tracks that end in mid-stride. It does not explain the circular path worn into the ground. It does not explain why their camp was left in perfect order with all their survival equipment untouched. And it does not explain the journal entries about something in the forest calling their names. I went back to that site 3 times over the following year, always hoping I had missed something, that there was some clue I had overlooked. The camp was gone, the tents and equipment removed by the families, but the circular track was still there. Even after a winter of snow and a summer of growth, you could still see where the ground had been worn down by someone walking in endless circles. The last time I visited, I brought a compass and a GPS unit. I wanted to check something that had been bothering me. The circular track, I discovered, was not quite perfect. It was slightly elliptical, stretched along a north-south axis, and the center point where the backpack had been found did not match up with any geological or magnetic anomaly. It was just ground, ordinary Alaskan tundra, no different from the surrounding terrain. But when I stood in the center of that circle and listened, I heard something. It was faint. So faint I could have convinced myself it was just the wind or the rustling of leaves. But it sounded like singing, like voices harmonizing in some language I did not recognize. And beneath that, quieter still, I heard something that might have been my name, just once. Barely audible, but distinct enough to make every hair on my body stand on end. I left immediately, and I have not been back since. The case remains open technically, but no one is actively searching anymore. The families held memorial services. The insurance companies eventually paid out the death benefits. Life moved on for everyone except me. I still think about those 4 men, about what happened to them in that forest. I think about the tracks that end in impossible places, about the journal entry warning against answering when something calls your name. And I think about that sound I heard standing in the circle that might have been singing and might have been my name being whispered by something that should not know it. Alaska is vast, millions of acres of wilderness where human presence is rare and temporary. We tell ourselves we understand it, that we have mapped and cataloged and made it safe. But cases like this remind me that there are still places where the rules we depend on do not apply, where people can walk 30 feet from their tents and vanish from existence, where something in the forest knows your name and calls to you in a voice that sounds almost human. The official files say the Riverside hunting party died of exposure in October of last year. But I know better. They did not die. They answered something that called to them, and it took them somewhere we cannot follow, somewhere beyond the reach of search and rescue, beyond the reach of any help we could provide. And whatever took them is still out there, singing in the empty places, waiting for the next person who will listen and answer and walk into the forest, never to return. My name is Mason, and for 15 years I prepared the dead in Koyuk, Alaska. It is not glamorous work, but someone has to do it. In a town of 200 people, there are no corporate funeral homes with multiple staff members and modern facilities. There is just me, working out of a converted house on the edge of town, doing everything from embalming to organizing services to digging graves when the ground is not frozen solid. People trusted me with their loved ones during the most difficult times of their lives. I took that responsibility seriously, which is why what I discovered haunts me more than anything else I have ever encountered. Koyuk sits on the Norton Sound, isolated even by Alaska standards. We get supplies by barge in summer and by small plane year-round when the weather cooperates. The population is mostly Inupiaq, families that have lived here for generations, and the sense of community is strong. Everyone knows everyone. Deaths are felt by the entire town, and funerals are major events where the whole community gathers. I had been doing this work since I was 25, learning the trade from the previous funeral director before he retired and moved south. He taught me everything about preservation, about treating remains with dignity, about the paperwork and the regulations. What he did not teach me, what I had to learn on my own, was how to spot the signs when death is not natural. It started with an elderly woman named Sarah. She was 83, had been in declining health for months, and when she passed in her sleep, no one was surprised. Her family asked me to prepare her for a traditional service and burial. I began the standard procedures, examining the body, documenting everything before embalming. That is when I noticed the discoloration. Her lips and fingernails had a faint blue tinge that seemed wrong. Not the blue of oxygen deprivation or cold, but something else. Chemical. I almost dismissed it. She was old, she had health problems, bodies do strange things when they shut down. But something made me take samples, tissue from her liver and kidneys, blood from the heart. I sent them to a lab in Anchorage that did work for rural medical examiners. The results came back 3 weeks later. Antifreeze, ethylene glycol in concentrations high enough to be fatal. I sat in my office staring at that report, trying to understand what it meant. Sarah had lived alone. She had no enemies that I knew of. The official cause of death on her certificate was heart failure, which technically was accurate because her heart had stopped. But the question was why? I thought about going to the state troopers, but with what evidence? A toxicology report on a woman who had already been buried for 3 weeks. And who would I accuse? I had no suspects, no motive, nothing but numbers on a page, so I did nothing. I filed the report away and tried to forget about it, but I could not. 3 months later, another death. A man in his 70s this time, found in his home by his daughter when he did not answer his phone. Natural causes, the village health aide said. Age and a bad heart. I prepared his body and noticed the same discoloration, the same blue tinge around the lips and under the nails. I took samples again, sent them to the same lab with a note asking them to expedite the analysis. The results were identical: antifreeze poisoning, fatal levels in his system. 2 deaths, same method, both dismissed as natural because the victims were old and sick. I started going through my records, looking at every death I had handled in the past 5 years. 17 bodies had passed through my preparation room. 12 had been obviously accidental or natural. Vehicle crashes, drownings, 1 hunting accident, several from cancer or known chronic conditions. But 5, including Sarah and the recent man, had been elderly people who died suddenly at home with minimal explanation. I did not have tissue samples from the earlier deaths, but I had photographs. Detailed documentation I took of every body as part of my standard procedure. I looked at those photos with new eyes and saw the same signs in 3 of the previous 5. The blue discoloration, subtle but present. If I was right, if my suspicion was correct, someone had been poisoning elderly residents of Koyuk for years. At least 5 victims, possibly more, that I had not caught. The question that terrified me was who? This was a small town where everyone knew everyone. The killer had to be someone with access to these people's homes, someone they trusted enough to accept food or drink from. And they had to be smart enough to target victims who would not be autopsied, whose deaths would be attributed to natural causes without investigation. I started asking careful questions. Who had visited Sarah in her final days? Who brought meals to the elderly? Who checked on the people who lived alone? The same name kept coming up. Clara. She was in her 50s, a lifelong resident of Koyuk, beloved by everyone for her volunteer work. She organized meal deliveries for seniors. She visited the sick and homebound. She was at every community event, every funeral, always ready to help, always smiling. The most trusted person in town. I did not want to believe it. I fought against the conclusion even as the evidence mounted. Clara had visited Sarah 3 days before her death, bringing homemade soup. She had been checking on the 70-year-old man regularly, making sure he took his medications. She had known all 5 victims, had access to all their homes, had opportunities to administer poison in food or drink that would be consumed without suspicion. But why? What possible motive could she have? I started digging deeper, looking at property records, wills, estate settlements. What I found made my blood run cold. 4 of the 5 victims had left money or property to the community in their wills. Modest amounts, but in a poor village like Koyuk it added up. And Clara sat on the board that administered those community funds. She had access. She had been embezzling for years small amounts that went unnoticed, using donations meant for the clinic and the school for her own purposes. The final piece fell into place when I learned that Sarah had been talking about changing her will the week before she died. She had told several people she wanted to leave her house to her niece instead of the community fund. 3 days later, after Clara's visit, Sarah was dead. The original will stood. I went to the state troopers with everything I had: the toxicology reports, the pattern of deaths, the financial records, the timeline. They investigated for 8 months, quietly, carefully building a case. They exhumed 2 of the bodies and confirmed antifreeze poisoning in both. They executed a search warrant on Clara's home and found ethylene glycol in her garage, stored in containers that she claimed were for her car, but that had never been used for that purpose. She was arrested on 5 counts of murder. The trial lasted 3 weeks and the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution demonstrated how she had systematically targeted elderly residents who lived alone, who had named the community fund in their wills, who would not be missed immediately. She would visit them, bring food or tea laced with antifreeze, and leave them to die slowly over the next few days. The symptoms mimicked natural illness, and in a remote village with limited medical resources, no one questioned it. The jury convicted her on all counts. She was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. But the damage to Koyuk went beyond the lives she took. She had shattered the trust that held the community together. People looked at their neighbors differently now, wondered who else might be capable of such calculated evil. The elderly became fearful of accepting help, isolated themselves rather than risk trusting the wrong person. And I was left with the knowledge that I had buried at least 2 murder victims without recognizing what had happened to them. If I had been more observant earlier, if I had questioned that first blue discoloration instead of dismissing it, lives might have been saved. That guilt sits with me every day. I still work in Koyuk. Someone has to. But I document everything now with obsessive detail. Every body that comes through gets photographed, sampled, analyzed. I send tissue to labs for screening even when the death seems obviously natural. I have become paranoid, seeing potential murder in every unexpected passing. The other funeral directors in Alaska think I am crazy when I talk at conferences about the importance of toxicology screening in rural deaths. Maybe I am, but I know what I missed, and I know what it cost. Clara sits in prison now, maintaining her innocence despite the evidence. She has supporters, people who refuse to believe that the woman who brought them soup and visited their sick relatives could be a killer. They write her letters, send her money, campaign for her release. It makes me sick, but I understand it. She was good at what she did, at presenting a face of kindness while calculating who to kill next. That is what makes her so terrifying. Not that she killed, but that she did it while being the most beloved person in town. The 5 confirmed victims are buried in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Norton Sound. I visit sometimes, standing among the graves, thinking about how they died alone and afraid, poisoned by someone they trusted. Their families have markers now that acknowledge the truth, that they were murdered, that their deaths were not the peaceful natural passing everyone had assumed. It is small comfort. I think about the other towns scattered across rural Alaska, places even more isolated than Koyuk, with even less oversight and resources. I think about how many Claras might be out there, preying on the vulnerable, hiding behind masks of community service and kindness. The truth is, we will never know. Most of those deaths will be buried as natural causes, the signs missed or ignored, the patterns never recognized. That is what terrifies me most. Not what I found, but what I might still be missing. Day 127 of winter isolation. Something is watching me. I know how that sounds. I know what people think when someone who has been alone in the Arctic darkness for 4 months starts talking about being watched. But I am trained to observe, to record, to document phenomena with scientific precision. And I am telling you, with absolute certainty, that something has been circling this station since the sun disappeared below the horizon in November. The Prudhoe Bay weather station sits on the northern edge of Alaska, as far north as you can go and still be on solid ground. It is a cluster of prefabricated buildings connected by enclosed walkways, surrounded by instruments and sensors that measure temperature, wind speed, atmospheric pressure, precipitation. My job is to maintain the equipment, record the data, and send reports to the National Weather Service 3 times daily. The posting lasts 6 months. November through April, the darkest, coldest months when the sun does not rise and temperatures drop to 60 below zero. I volunteered for this assignment. The pay is exceptional and I needed the money. Student loans, medical bills, the usual burdens that drive people to accept positions in places no one else wants to go. The orientation was thorough. They warned me about the isolation, about the darkness, about the psychological effects of spending months alone in extreme conditions. They gave me tests to make sure I was mentally stable, capable of handling the solitude. I passed everything. I thought I was prepared. The first month was fine. I established routines, kept myself busy with maintenance and observations, video called with my family twice a week when the satellite connection was working. I exercised, read books, cooked elaborate meals to pass the time. The darkness was oppressive but manageable. I had lights, I had heat, I had everything I needed to survive comfortably. It was in the second month that I started noticing the irregularities. Small things at first, footprints in the snow near the instrument array that were not mine. I assumed they were old prints preserved in the frozen ground from before I arrived. But new ones appeared after every storm, always in the same pattern, always circling the perimeter of the station at exactly 50 yards distance. Never closer, never farther. A perfect circle. I checked the security cameras, but they showed nothing. Just empty darkness and blowing snow. I increased the sensitivity, adjusted the angles, reviewed hours of footage, nothing. But the footprints kept appearing. Not human prints, not exactly. The stride was too long, the pattern too regular. They were there every morning when I went out to clear snow from the instruments. Then the atmospheric readings started going wrong. My instruments began recording phenomena that should not exist at this latitude. Sudden pressure drops that had no meteorological explanation. Temperature spikes of 20 degrees in the span of minutes, then dropping back down just as quickly. Wind patterns that defied the models, swirling in directions that made no physical sense. I reported the anomalies to the National Weather Service. They suggested equipment malfunction. I ran diagnostics on every instrument. Everything tested normal. The readings were accurate. The atmosphere itself was behaving in ways that violated what I understood about weather systems. On day 93, I heard the knocking. It started just after midnight, a steady rhythmic sound on the exterior wall of my sleeping quarters. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Over and over. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, checking the walls for loose panels or debris that might be banging in the wind. There was nothing. But as I stood there in the darkness, my breath freezing in the beam of my flashlight, the knocking moved. It traveled around the building, always staying on the opposite side from where I was standing. I walked faster, trying to catch up to it. It moved faster. I ran. It matched my speed exactly, staying just out of sight. I went back inside and locked the door. The knocking continued for 3 hours, circling the building endlessly, never stopping, never varying its rhythm. Then, at 3 in the morning, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. After that night, things escalated. My equipment started recording sounds on frequencies that should not register on weather instruments. Low pulses almost below the threshold of human hearing, emanating from somewhere north of the station. I isolated the recordings and played them back at higher volumes. They sounded like breathing. Slow, deep, rhythmic breathing, as if something enormous was sleeping just beyond the reach of my instruments. The footprints got closer. Not by much, maybe a yard every few days, but the circle was definitely contracting. I measured it obsessively, documenting the distance with scientific precision. 50 yards, then 49, then 48. Whatever was making those prints was spiraling inward, taking its time, patient in a way that suggested intelligence and purpose. I tried calling for extraction. The satellite phone connected, but every time I explained what was happening, the line would fill with static and disconnect. I sent emails that bounced back as undeliverable. I recorded video messages that corrupted before they could upload. It was as if something was actively preventing me from communicating what I was experiencing. On day 110, I saw it for the first time. I was outside doing my routine instrument check when the aurora appeared. Not unusual for this latitude, but the colors were wrong. Instead of green and blue, these lights were deep red and purple, colors I had never seen in auroral displays. They pulsed and writhed across the sky like living things. And beneath them, illuminated by that crimson light, I saw the shapes. They stood at the edge of my visibility, exactly where the footprints had been circling. Tall, impossibly tall, with proportions that hurt to look at. Their limbs were too long and bent at angles that defied anatomy. There were 3 of them, maybe more, standing perfectly still, facing the station, watching. I ran inside and sealed the door. I turned off all the exterior lights and sat in the dark, watching the security monitors. The red aurora continued to pulse, and in its light I could see them moving closer. Not walking, not exactly. They seemed to glide across the snow, their movements fluid and wrong, like watching film played at the incorrect speed. They reached the 30-yard mark and stopped. For the rest of the night they stood there, motionless, arranged in a triangle around the station. When dawn finally came, or what passed for dawn in the perpetual twilight of Arctic winter, they were gone. But the footprints remained, now pressed deep into the ice at 30 yards exactly. My equipment recorded everything that night. Temperature drops of 50 degrees in localized areas. Electromagnetic disturbances that fried 2 of my sensors. And sounds captured on my weather microphones that defied explanation. Voices, if they could be called that, speaking in harmonics that overlapped and interfered with each other, creating patterns that seemed designed rather than random. I spent the next week analyzing the recordings. The vocal patterns, when run through spectral analysis software, formed images. Geometric shapes that repeated and evolved, like a language written in sound and frequency. I am not a linguist and I could not decode them, but the intent was clear. They were communicating, not with me but about me. Discussing the station, the equipment, my presence. The circle continued to contract. 25 yards, 20, 15. Every night they came closer, standing in their triangle formation, watching with whatever served as their perception. The aurora appeared more frequently now, those wrong colors bleeding across the sky, and in its light I could see more details. Their surfaces seemed to shift and flow, neither solid nor liquid, but something in between. Where they stood, the snow did not accumulate. It simply disappeared, sublimating directly from ice to vapor without melting. On day 120, my instruments detected something new. A sound, low frequency, building slowly over the course of hours. It registered on my seismographs as vibration, on my microphones as tone, on my electromagnetic sensors as interference. It was coming from all three of them simultaneously, harmonizing, the frequencies aligning into a resonance that made the walls of the station vibrate. I realized what they were doing. They were testing the station's structural frequency, searching for the resonance that would allow them to pass through the walls without breaching them. They were not trying to break in. They were trying to phase in, to occupy the same space without displacing the matter that was already there. That night I did not sleep. I could not. The sound built through the dark hours, growing louder, more focused. My instruments began to fail one by one, overwhelmed by the interference. The walls hummed and blurred at the edges of my vision. I could feel them getting closer, not in physical distance but in dimensional proximity. They were approaching from a direction that had no name, sliding through angles of space that human geometry could not describe. At 3 a.m, the sound reached its peak. The station filled with that awful humming resonance, and I could see them inside with me. Translucent, overlapping with the walls and furniture, their incomprehensible forms pressing into 3-dimensional space from somewhere else. They looked at me, though they had nothing I could identify as eyes, and in that moment I understood. They had always been here. Not in this station specifically, but in this place, in the Arctic darkness, existing in frequencies and dimensions that overlapped with ours but rarely intersected. The station, with its instruments and electromagnetic fields and constant generation of heat and sound, had made us visible to each other. We had attracted their attention simply by being here, by radiating signals into spectrums they inhabited. They were not hostile, they were curious. But their curiosity was as dangerous as any predator's hunger because they did not understand the fragility of human biology. They wanted to observe, to interact, to study. And in doing so, they would unmake me, pulling me into their frequencies until I existed in the same dimensionless way they did. The resonance broke at dawn. The sun, though still below the horizon, had risen enough to change the electromagnetic conditions. They faded, retreating to whatever space they normally occupied, leaving me shaking and sick on the floor of the station. But I knew they would return. Every night getting closer, refining their approach, learning how to synchronize with our reality. I am writing this on day 127. The footprints are now at 10 yards. Tonight they will likely reach the station walls. My extraction is scheduled for day 180, 53 days from now. I will not last that long. I can feel it in the way the air has begun to shimmer, in the way sounds take too long to reach my ears, in the way my own reflection in the windows seems slightly out of sync with my movements. If you find this record, if anyone comes to this station after I am gone, understand that I was not driven mad by isolation. I was observed by something that exists in the spaces between what we can perceive, and that observation has changed me in ways I cannot reverse. The darkness up here is not empty. It never has been. We just lacked the instruments to measure what fills it. They are knocking again. 3 times, pause 3 times. But now the sound is coming from inside the walls. I am Jack, and I taught elementary school in Kobuk for 7 years. It is a small village on the Kobuk River, population around 150, most of them Inupiaq families who have lived there for generations. Teaching in rural Alaska is unlike teaching anywhere else. You wear multiple hats. You adapt to limited resources, and you become part of a tight-knit community where everyone knows your business. I loved that job. I love those kids. But the pictures my students drew in the spring of 2018 still wake me at night, and I cannot shake the feeling that I failed to protect them from something I should have seen coming. It started with a simple art project. We were studying seasons, and I asked the third graders to draw what they thought spring would look like. This is common in Arctic communities where the children experience months of darkness and cold. Drawing bright flowers and sunshine helps them anticipate the coming warmth. Most of the kids drew the usual things: melting snow, returning birds, the river breaking up, their families fishing or hunting. Normal, happy images of seasonal change. But 3 students, sitting at different tables with no view of each other's work, drew something else entirely. They drew the ice, not the river ice breaking up, which would have been expected. They drew massive ice formations, jagged and towering, rising out of the ground near the village. And in each drawing, barely visible among the ice structures, were figures. Dark shapes that might have been people, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. I noticed the similarity immediately. When you teach the same small group of kids for years, you learn to recognize when they are copying each other or when they have seen something that impressed them all. But these 3 had been working independently, and their drawings, while similar in theme, showed different perspectives of the same scene. Different angles, different levels of detail, but unmistakably depicting the same event. I asked the first child, a girl named Sarah, what she had drawn. She said it was what was coming. I asked her what she meant. She said the ice people were coming in spring when the ground melted. They would come up from underneath and walk among the houses. I asked where she had heard this story. She insisted she had not heard it anywhere. She had dreamed it 3 nights in a row, the same dream each time. The second child, a boy named Thomas, told me essentially the same thing. Dreams, recurring ones, about ice formations erupting from the ground and figures emerging from them. The third child would not talk about it at all. She just shook her head and pushed the drawing away, clearly distressed. I collected the drawings and set them aside, unsure what to make of them. Children have vivid imaginations, and nightmares are common, especially during the dark winter months when daylight is scarce. I mentioned it to the other teacher at the school, a woman who had lived in Kobuk her entire life. She looked at the drawings for a long time, her expression growing troubled. Then she told me about the old stories. According to traditional Inupiaq beliefs in the region, there are things that live beneath the permafrost. Not spirits exactly, but beings that exist in the frozen ground, dormant for years or decades, that sometimes emerge when conditions are right. The elders spoke of years when the thaw came too fast or too slow, when the ice behaved strangely and figures were seen walking near the village at dawn or dusk. Tall, thin figures that moved wrong and disappeared when approached. She said these stories were old and not widely shared anymore, especially not with children. The 3 students who had drawn the ice people came from traditional families, but she doubted their parents had told them these stories. They were considered frightening and inappropriate for young kids. Over the next week, more drawings appeared. I had not assigned any art projects, but during free time or recess, students would gravitate toward the paper and crayons and draw. Always the same theme: ice formations, dark figures, and in some of the more detailed drawings, the figures were shown entering houses, standing in doorways, or watching from the edge of the village. The children who drew these pictures seemed compelled to do so. They were not distressed while drawing, just focused and quiet, working with unusual concentration for their age. But afterward, when I asked them about the images, they became uncomfortable. Some said they did not know why they had drawn what they drew. Others said they had to draw it, that it needed to be shown. I called a meeting with the parents. About half attended, which was typical for the community where subsistence activities often took priority over school events. I showed them the drawings and explained my concern. Some parents dismissed it as imagination, kids influenced by stories or movies. But several of the older family members, grandparents who spoke primarily Inupiaq, looked at the drawings and grew very quiet. One grandmother asked if anyone had noticed anything unusual about the river ice this year. She was right. The ice had been behaving strangely. Normally it breaks up in late May following a predictable pattern as temperatures rise. But this year, even though it was only mid-April, sections of ice had broken free prematurely. And in other areas, the ice seemed thicker than usual, building up instead of melting. The patterns were irregular, creating pressure ridges and formations that the longtime residents said they had never seen before. 2 weeks after the drawing started, the first ice formation appeared. It was about a mile upriver from the village, a mass of ice that had pushed up through the riverbank and frozen into a jagged tower maybe 15 feet high. It happened overnight. The villagers who noticed it were confused because the temperature had been above freezing for days. Ice should have been melting, not forming new structures. More formations appeared over the next few days. They emerged from the ground near the river, but also in the tundra beyond the village, rising up through the softening permafrost like the earth was pushing them out. The shapes were irregular but always vertical, always tall and narrow, and they did not melt even as the air temperature climbed into the 40s. The children became increasingly agitated. Several of them refused to go outside for recess. They clustered near the windows, staring at the ice formations in the distance, whispering to each other in a mix of English and Inupiaq. I heard them using a word I did not recognize, repeating it like a warning or a prayer. I asked the Inupiaq language teacher what the word meant. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, then told me it translated roughly to, "the ones who wait beneath." She said it was from old stories about beings that lived in the frozen ground, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The stories said they appeared during years when the seasons changed wrong, when spring came too early or winter lasted too long, when the natural order was disrupted. That night I stayed late at the school reviewing the drawings again, trying to find some rational explanation. I spread them out on my desk, more than 30 images now from 12 different students. As I looked at them collectively, I noticed something I had missed before. The figures in the drawings were not random. They were positioned in specific locations around the village. I got a map of Kobuk and tried to match the perspectives in the drawings to actual geographic positions. The correlation was terrifying. The students had drawn the figures standing in locations that corresponded exactly to where the ice formations had appeared. But the drawings had been made 2 weeks before the formations emerged. The children had somehow known where the ice would push through the ground before it happened. I brought this to the village council. Some members were skeptical, but others, particularly the elders, took it seriously. They organized a traditional gathering, something I was not usually included in. But they made an exception given the circumstances. What they discussed, I learned later, was whether to perform certain ceremonies meant to appease or ward off the beings from beneath the ice. The ceremonies were held over 3 nights. I was not present, but I heard the drums from my house, rhythmic and deep, continuing until dawn. The children were kept inside during these nights, instructed not to look out the windows or go outside for any reason. On the 4th morning, the ice formations began to collapse, not melting slowly but falling apart suddenly, crumbling into fragments that turned to slush within hours. By afternoon, there was no trace of them except disturbed ground and patches of mud where they had stood. The children stopped drawing. The nightmares, as far as I could tell from talking to parents, ceased. The village returned to normal, preparing for the fishing season, and everyone seemed eager to forget what had happened. But I could not forget. I spent that summer researching permafrost behavior, looking for scientific explanations for what I had witnessed. Methane pockets can cause ground to heave. Ice lenses form in soil under certain conditions. There are documented cases of frost heaves creating unusual formations. But nothing I read explained the timing, the locations, or the children's knowledge of where the formations would appear before they did. I taught in Kobuk for 1 more year after that, but my heart was not in it anymore. The children seemed fine, back to their normal energy and creativity, drawing typical pictures of animals and family and daily life. But sometimes I would catch them staring out the windows toward the tundra, watching the ground like they were waiting for it to open again. I left Kobuk in the spring of 2020 and took a teaching position in Fairbanks. I told everyone it was for career advancement, better resources, more opportunities, but the truth is, I was afraid of what I had seen, afraid of what the children had known, afraid that it would happen again and next time the ceremonies might not work. I keep those drawings in a box in my closet, 32 images of ice and shadow drawn by children who somehow perceived something adults could not. I look at them sometimes, usually late at night when I cannot sleep, and I wonder what those figures were. Whether they were physical beings that lived in the permafrost, spiritual entities from a Inupiaq tradition, or something else entirely that our science and our stories both fail to adequately explain. The elders in Kobuk believe the children could see them because children are closer to the spirit world, not yet fully bound by the rational adult mind that filters out impossible things. They believe the drawings were not imagination but documentation, the children recording what they perceived as a warning to the rest of us. I do not know what I believe. I only know that 12 children in a remote Alaskan village drew pictures of something that had not yet happened, and then it happened exactly as they depicted. I know that ice formations appeared in impossible conditions and collapsed just as impossibly after traditional ceremonies were performed. And I know that somewhere beneath the frozen ground of rural Alaska, there might be things that wait and watch, and occasionally, when conditions align in ways we do not understand, they try to emerge into our world. The children saw them coming. They tried to warn us through the only means they had, through drawings that adults dismissed as imagination until it was almost too late. I failed those students by not taking their visions seriously sooner. I am grateful that others in the community, people with deeper knowledge of the land and its mysteries, knew what to do. But I carry the guilt of my skepticism, and I wonder how many other warnings from children go unheeded because adults are too rational, too educated, too removed from traditional knowledge to recognize truth when it is shown to them in crayon and paper. I have driven every frozen route in Alaska, the Dalton Highway, the Elliott Highway, the winter roads that only exist when the rivers and lakes freeze solid enough to support 18-wheelers loaded with equipment bound for remote mines and oil fields. I have driven through whiteouts, through 50 below temperatures, through conditions that would terrify most people. But the Dalton Highway in the winter of 2003 almost killed me, and it was not the weather that nearly did it. The Dalton is 414 miles of gravel and ice stretching from just north of Fairbanks all the way to Deadhorse on the Arctic Ocean. In winter, it is one of the most dangerous roads in the world. No services for hundreds of miles, no cell phone coverage, temperatures that can freeze exposed skin in minutes. You drive it alone, you watch for wildlife, and you pray your equipment does not fail, because help is hours away at best. I was hauling drilling equipment to Prudhoe Bay, a routine run I had made dozens of times. Left Fairbanks on a Tuesday morning in February, loaded and ready for the 12-hour drive north. The weather forecast was clear, temperatures hovering around 30 below, good visibility. I had driven in far worse. The first 100 miles went smoothly. I passed a few southbound trucks, exchanged brief radio greetings, and settled into the rhythm of the road. It was around noon when I came across the stranded vehicle, a pickup truck, newer model sitting half on the shoulder with its flashers on. In that cold, you do not drive past someone who might need help. People die out here if they are left alone with a broken vehicle. I pulled over ahead of the truck and grabbed my radio, calling in my position and the situation in case anyone else was monitoring. I walked back to the pickup. The driver was standing beside it, bundled in a parka, hood up. He waved as I approached, and I could see his breath fogging heavily in the cold air. I asked if he needed help. He said his truck had lost power, just died on him, and he could not get it started. I asked how long he had been stopped. He said maybe 20 minutes. That should have been my first warning. 20 minutes in that cold with the engine off, the cab would have been freezing. But he seemed calm, not shivering, not showing signs of cold stress. I chalked it up to good gear and recent activity trying to fix the problem. I offered to take a look at the engine. He thanked me and popped the hood. I spent 15 minutes troubleshooting. The battery seemed fine, connections were clean, fuel lines were not frozen. I could not find an obvious problem, but the truck would not turn over. I told him I could give him a ride to the next truck stop about 60 miles north, where he could arrange for a tow. He agreed and went to grab some things from his truck. That is when I noticed the ice. On the ground around his truck, there were patches of ice that should not have been there. The road was snow-covered but dry. These patches looked like something had melted and refrozen, dark ice with an oily sheen. And there was a smell, faint but distinct, metallic and chemical, like antifreeze mixed with something else. He came back carrying a duffel bag. I asked him what was in the bag. He said tools and personal items. Something about the way he answered made me uneasy. Too quick, too casual. I told him to leave the bag, that I could not have unsecured cargo in my cab. He insisted he needed it. I insisted harder. He finally put it back in his truck, but I could see the tension in his movements, a coiled readiness that set my instincts screaming. We got into my truck and I started driving. He sat in the passenger seat, quiet at first, staring out at the endless white landscape. I tried to make conversation, asking where he was headed, what brought him up the Dalton in winter. His answers were vague and inconsistent. First he said he worked on the North Slope. Then he said he was visiting family. Then he said he was just passing through. None of it made sense. About 10 miles down the road, I glanced at my mirrors and saw smoke. Black smoke rising from where we had left his truck. I mentioned it to him. He looked back and said it must have caught fire, probably an electrical problem. His tone was flat, no surprise or concern. A man's truck had just caught fire on one of the most remote highways in North America, and he reacted like I had commented on the weather. That is when I knew something was very wrong. I kept driving, but I was alert now, watching him from the corner of my eye, planning what I would do if he made a move. My emergency kit was behind my seat, including a tire iron and a knife. My CB radio was on, though we were in a dead zone with no one likely to hear us. He started talking, his voice changing, becoming more animated. He talked about how isolated the Dalton was, how a person could disappear out here and never be found. He talked about the truckers he had met over the years, the ones who stopped to help, the ones who trusted too easily. And he talked about winter, about how cold preserves things, how evidence can be buried under snow and not found until spring, if ever. I told him to shut up. He laughed and asked if I was scared. I told him I had been driving this highway since before he was born and I was not scared of anything. But I was. My hands were tight on the wheel and my heart was pounding. He reached into his parka and pulled out a knife, not a folding knife, but a fixed blade, maybe 8 inches long. He held it casually, not threatening yet, just showing me he had it. He said I had been very kind to stop and help him, but kindness was a weakness out here. He said he had been waiting for 2 days for someone to stop, Someone driving a big truck that could get him farther north without being noticed. I did not give him time to say anything else. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, sending the truck into a controlled skid. He was thrown against the door, losing his grip on the knife. It fell to the floor between us. I stomped on the brakes and we slid to a stop in a shower of snow and gravel. I grabbed the tire iron from behind my seat and had it against his throat before he could recover. I told him to get out. He stared at me, rage and calculation warring in his eyes. For a moment I thought he would fight, but then he opened the door and stepped out into the cold. I threw his knife out after him far enough that he would have to move away from the truck to retrieve it. I pulled back onto the highway and drove, watching in my mirrors as he stood there in the middle of the road, growing smaller in the distance. I drove for 20 miles before I hit an area with CB reception and called for help. I reported everything: the stranded truck that was now burning, the man I had left on the highway, the knife, the threats. The state troopers found him 6 hours later trying to wave down another truck 50 miles from where I had left him. They arrested him and impounded what was left of his burned truck. What they found in that truck, in the parts that had not been destroyed by fire, made national news. There were personal effects belonging to 4 different people. Driver licenses, wallets, jewelry. 2 of the licenses matched missing persons reports from the past 2 years. Both were truckers who had vanished on the Dalton Highway, their vehicles never found. The investigators believe he staged breakdowns, waited for Good Samaritans to stop, then killed them and disposed of their bodies in the wilderness. His truck had not broken down. He had disabled it himself, killing the fuel pump. The oily ice I had seen was hydraulic fluid he had drained deliberately to create a puddle that would refreeze and make the breakdown look legitimate. He had been doing this for years, targeting the Dalton specifically because of its isolation and the culture among drivers of helping each other. The trial revealed he had killed at least 7 people, though they only had solid evidence for 4. He is serving 7 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security prison in Colorado. But I think about him sometimes, about how close I came. If I had not noticed the ice, if I had not questioned his story, if I had not reacted when he pulled that knife, I would have been number 8. My truck would have been found eventually, months later, maybe stripped and abandoned on some side road. My body might never have been found at all, just another name added to the list of people who vanished into Alaska's wilderness. The Dalton Highway is still dangerous. The weather, the isolation, the wildlife, all of it can kill you if you are not careful. But the worst danger I ever faced on that road was not nature. It was a man who understood how to exploit the very thing that makes the trucking community strong: our willingness to help each other. He turned our best instinct into a weapon and used it to hunt us on our own routes. I still drive the Dalton. I have to. It is my livelihood, and I am too old to start over in another line of work. But I do not stop for stranded vehicles anymore unless there are multiple witnesses or I have backup. I tell other drivers to do the same. It has made us harder, more suspicious, less willing to trust. That is what he took from us beyond the lives he stole. He took the certainty that helping someone in need was always the right thing to do. Some of the younger drivers do not believe me when I tell this story. They think I am paranoid, that I am overreacting to a single incident. But they did not see his eyes when he showed me that knife. They did not hear the way he talked about the other truckers he had killed, casual and calm, like he was discussing the weather. They did not feel what it was like to realize that the person sitting 3 feet away from you had been planning your death since the moment you stopped to help. The ice roads of Alaska are empty now. Just me and the endless white and the knowledge that predators come in many forms. Some have 4 legs and hunt by instinct. Others walk upright and hunt with calculation and patience, understanding that in the most remote places, trust is abundant and witnesses are scarce. I survived because I recognized the signs before it was too late. 7 others were not as fortunate. Their names are on a memorial plaque at the Yukon River crossing, along with dozens of others who died on the Dalton over the years. Most died from cold or accidents or bad luck, but at least 7 died because they stopped to help and paid for their kindness with their lives. For 20 years, I have been the voice between life and death. When someone needs rescue in the most remote parts of northern Alaska, when a hunter gets lost or a plane goes down or a village needs medical evacuation, they call me. I coordinate search and rescue, I dispatch emergency services, I stay on the line with people until help arrives. I have talked people through hypothermia, through bear attacks, through situations where I was the only thing standing between them and death. But some transmissions should never be answered. Some calls come from places that do not exist anymore, from people who should not be able to call. And once you respond to those transmissions, you cannot unhear what they tell you. It started 3 years ago on a January night when the temperature was 52 below zero and the darkness was absolute. I was working the midnight shift, monitoring multiple emergency frequencies when I received a distress call on channel 16. The voice was male, panicked, reporting that his plane had gone down somewhere north of Anaktuvuk Pass. He gave coordinates, said he was injured, said he needed immediate extraction. Standard emergency protocol. I logged the call and started coordinating a response. I contacted the Alaska Rescue Coordination Center, gave them the coordinates and situation details, and they dispatched a helicopter from Deadhorse. Estimated time to the crash site was 90 minutes. I stayed on the radio with the pilot, trying to keep him calm, getting more information about his injuries and condition. He said he had been flying supplies to a mining camp when his engine failed. He managed to get the plane down but hit hard. He thought his leg was broken. He was cold, getting colder. His emergency locator beacon was not working. He needed help soon or he would freeze to death. I assured him help was coming, told him to stay in the plane and wrap himself in whatever he could find for insulation. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said the mining camp he had been flying to was called Cold Stone Creek. I asked him to repeat that. He said it again. Cold Stone Creek, about 40 miles north of Anaktuvuk Pass. I pulled up my maps, cross-referenced every database I had access to. There was no mining camp called Cold Stone Creek. There had never been one, at least not in any records from the past 50 years. I asked him how long he had been flying to this camp. He said 3 years, regular supply runs every 2 weeks. I asked what company operated the mine. He gave me a name I did not recognize. I ran a search while keeping him talking. The company had existed, but it had gone bankrupt in 1978. Their mining claims had been abandoned decades ago. I told him to stay calm, that rescue was on the way, but I was deeply unsettled. The coordinates he had given me corresponded to empty tundra, no structures, no activity. I pulled up satellite imagery from the previous summer. Nothing but wilderness. I contacted the helicopter crew and told them to be cautious, that something about this call was not adding up. The helicopter reached the coordinates he had provided. They found nothing. No plane, no wreckage, no emergency flares, no tracks in the snow. They did a grid search for 10 miles in every direction. Empty. I tried calling the pilot back on the radio, no response. The frequency was silent. I filed a detailed incident report, including the full recording of the conversation. The report was flagged as unusual and forwarded to the National Transportation Safety Board. They investigated and found no record of any aircraft matching the description the pilot had given me. No flight plan had been filed. No plane was reported missing. The tail number he had provided belonged to a Cessna that had crashed near Anaktuvuk Pass in 1984, killing the pilot on impact. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had been pranking me, though that seemed unlikely given how remote and serious emergency radio channels are. Maybe it was some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, a signal bouncing from somewhere else. But the voice had been so clear, so immediate, so desperate, and the details he provided were too specific, too consistent with historical records I had not even known existed until I started researching afterward. That was the first call. There have been others. A woman calling from the village of Tikigak, reporting that her husband had not returned from a seal hunt and a storm was coming. Tikigak exists, or rather it existed. It is the old name for Point Hope, a name that has not been commonly used since the 1950s. When I tried to coordinate a search, the modern Point Hope authorities had no record of anyone missing. The woman's description of the village, the houses she mentioned, the landmarks, they matched Point Hope from decades ago, not the current layout. A search and rescue team calling in their position, saying they were looking for a downed bomber from Ladd Field. Ladd Field was the World War II era name for what is now Fort Wainwright in Fairbanks. The transmission was scratchy, filled with static, but I could hear multiple voices in the background, men talking about coordinates and search grids and the need to find the crew before the Soviets did. A child calling for help, saying her family's snow machine had broken down and they were stranded somewhere on the tundra near a place called Utqiagvik Station. I tried to get more information, asked her to describe landmarks. Tried to keep her calm. She said they had been traveling from the station back to their winter camp. Utqiagvik is the modern name for Barrow, but there was never a station there by that specific name. The child's voice faded in and out, and then the transmission ended. When I tried to call back, there was only static. These calls come maybe once every few months. Always late at night, always in winter when the darkness is deepest. They are brief, never lasting more than 10 or 15 minutes before the signal cuts out. And they are always reporting situations that sound urgent and real. But when I try to coordinate responses, there is nothing to find. No people, no wreckage, no evidence that the emergency ever existed in our present. I have kept detailed logs of every anomalous transmission, dates, times, frequencies, exact wording, coordinates when provided. I have shared these logs with researchers who study electromagnetic phenomena in the Arctic, with physicists who specialize in atmospheric propagation, with anyone who might have an explanation. The theories range from time slips to parallel dimensions to some unknown property of the aurora borealis that can carry radio signals across temporal barriers. What disturbs me most is not the impossibility of these calls. It is the realization that these people, these voices calling for help, they are real. They were real. They existed in their own time, experiencing genuine emergencies, and somehow their distress signals are reaching across decades to my radio. And I can do nothing to help them. I coordinate rescues that arrive too late by 40 or 60 or 80 years. I talk to people who died long before I was born, and I cannot save them. The worst call came 6 months ago. A man radioed in from a location he identified as Flaxman Island, saying his expedition was trapped by ice, their ship crushed, and they needed rescue before winter set in fully. The details he provided matched the Stephenson expedition of 1914, an Arctic exploration that became trapped in the ice and resulted in multiple deaths. The man I spoke to, his voice clear despite heavy static, was describing events from over a century ago as they were happening. I stayed on the radio with him for 11 minutes. I told him rescue was being coordinated, that he needed to keep his men together and conserve resources. He thanked me, said it gave him hope to know someone had heard their call. Then the transmission ended. I sat in silence, staring at my equipment, knowing that the man I had just spoken to had died in 1915, frozen in the Arctic ice, having never received the rescue he was promised. I have started to dread the night shifts. Every time a call comes in, I wonder if it will be another temporal anomaly, another voice from the past reaching across time to ask for help I cannot give. Some of my colleagues think I am losing my mind, that the isolation and the stress of the job have made me unstable. But I have the recordings, hours of transmissions that should not exist, voices speaking about places and events that are decades out of time. The Alaska Rescue Coordination Center has quietly started flagging certain types of calls as potential anomalies. They will not admit it officially, but they have protocols now for when coordinates do not match current geography or when details suggest historical rather than current events. Other emergency operators have reported similar experiences, though most are reluctant to document them for fear of being dismissed as unreliable. I think the Arctic itself is doing this somehow. The extreme conditions, the electromagnetic disturbances from the aurora, the way the atmosphere behaves at high latitudes, all of it creates conditions where time is not as linear as it should be. Radio waves that should dissipate are instead preserved, frozen in the magnetosphere or the ionosphere, and occasionally they bleed through to the present. We are receiving distress calls from disasters that happened generations ago, echoes of emergencies that were never resolved. The ethical weight of this is crushing. Every anomalous call represents real people who died waiting for rescue. People who believed that help was coming because I told them it was. And now their final transmissions reach me across time, replaying their hope and fear and desperation, and there is nothing I can do except listen and log the details and file reports that no one knows how to act on. Last week I received a call from a pilot reporting engine trouble over the Brooks Range. He gave me a tail number, coordinates, estimated time before he would have to attempt an emergency landing. Everything about the call seemed current and normal until he mentioned he was carrying mail and supplies to a camp near Wiseman. The way he described Wiseman matched the town's layout from the 1930s, not the present. I coordinated a helicopter response anyway, hoping this time would be different, that somehow this call was legitimate despite the discrepancies. They found nothing, just like all the others. Empty wilderness, no trace of aircraft or distress. And I was left wondering if somewhere in another version of time, that pilot made it down safely, or if he joined the ranks of those whose final moments are preserved in radio signals that echo endlessly through the Arctic night. I will complete my 20-year tenure in this position next month. I have already decided not to renew my contract. I cannot continue being the voice on the other end of calls I cannot help. Cannot continue telling people that rescue is coming when I know it will never arrive. 20 years of saving lives has been meaningful, but the weight of the calls I cannot answer has become unbearable. Someone else will take this position. Someone else will sit at this console on winter nights and monitor these frequencies, and eventually they will receive their first anomalous call. A voice from the past, desperate and afraid, calling for help that is decades too late. They will try to coordinate a response and find nothing. And they will realize, as I did, that they are not just an emergency operator for northern Alaska. They are a witness to temporal echoes, a listener for voices that should have fallen silent long ago, but somehow continue to cry out across time, forever waiting for rescue that exists only in another reality.